The camera glides over Manhattan in the late 19th century. Gas lamps flicker on tree-lined streets. Elegant carriages clatter over cobblestones. A hidden world of wealth, ambition, and secret vice awaits. In the heart of Murray Hill, at 44th Street between 5th and Madison, there stood a brownstone unlike any other in America, Richard Canfield's Palace of Chance. Here, the wealthiest men of the Gilded Age gambled not in smoky dens, but in a refined environment of velvet drapes, crystal chandeliers, and the discreet service of impeccably trained staff. Losing money here was almost an art. Richard Canfield was no ordinary gambler. A self-educated man from modest origins, he had risen through sheer ambition and cunning, turning vice into elegance. He understood the human psyche, the thrill of risk, and the allure of sophistication. To his patrons, he offered discretion. To the law, he was a criminal. To friends like the painter James McNeill Whistler, he was a cultivated gentleman. But Canfield's story is not simply one of wealth and influence. It is a story of paradox. A philosopher who studied Schopenhauer, a man who profited from the compulsions of others, yet sought beauty in art and refinement in life. His life was a high-stakes game, not just at the tables, but with society itself. As progressive reformers swept across America, Canfield's empire faced its first real threat. Raids, prosecutions, and changing public sentiment gradually dismantled the world he had meticulously built. Yet, he adapted, transforming from gambling king to art collector, leaving behind a legacy that still fascinates, puzzles, and challenges our understanding of morality, ambition, and taste. This is the story of Richard Canfield, the gambler, the philosopher, the patron, the man who made vice elegant and whose life continues to provoke questions about wealth, power, and human desire. Step behind the closed doors of the Palace of Chance and into the gilded world of America's most enigmatic figure. In the dim light of Providence, Rhode Island, a young Richard Canfield watched the ships move in and out of the harbor. Born in 1855 into a family of modest means, he was the son of a declining whaling port, a place where fortunes had once been made, but where opportunity was fading. The streets smelled of salt and coal. The buildings bore the weight of centuries of commerce. It was a world of contrast, wealth and poverty rubbing elbows in narrow alleys, ambition fermenting in the hearts of those who dared to rise. From a young age, Canfield displayed a sharp mind and an insatiable curiosity. Formal education was limited, but he compensated with an autodidactic rigor. Philosophy, history, literature, he absorbed it all. Schopenhauer, in particular, fascinated him, with the German philosopher's insistence that life was a game of desire, suffering, and calculation. Canfield's early reading would later inform not only his approach to business, but also the calm, detached air he projected to the world. Yet, ambition is seldom a solitary force. Providence offered few legitimate avenues for someone without wealth, connections, or pedigree. Canfield turned to the one skill that promised both profit and opportunity: gambling. Not as a casual player, but as a strategist, a tactician who understood odds, psychology, and the subtle currents of human behavior. Cards were not mere entertainment for him. They were instruments of insight, tools for measuring patience, composure, and temperament. By the late 1870s, Canfield had his first brushes with the law. A 6-month prison sentence in Providence, though brief, left a lasting impression. He learned that legality and morality were not always aligned, and that human institutions could be navigated and, at times, manipulated. The lesson was clear: success required cunning, discretion, and an unerring eye for opportunity. After his release, Canfield moved with purpose. He cultivated relationships, observed the wealthy, and slowly established himself as more than a mere gambler. He understood that to rise, he needed to appear cultivated and trustworthy. Refinement became a tool as powerful as strategy at the table. Patrons would come not just to play, but to be impressed by the environment, by the manners, by the aura of elegance that surrounded him. Providence became his training ground. Here, he tested operations that combined discretion, sophistication, and psychological insight. Each venture was a lesson in human behavior. Each successful evening reinforced his understanding. People gamble not merely for money but for recognition, thrill, and and the rare approval of someone who understands them. Canfield offered that understanding. He offered refinement where others offered only vice. By the 1880s, Richard Canfield was no longer just a young man from Providence. He had become a figure of quiet authority in the gambling world, respected even by those who would call him a criminal. His operations were still small, localized, and semi-legal, but the foundations of something larger, more audacious, and more enduring were being laid. The boy from a declining port had learned the rules of the game, not just at the tables, but in life. He was preparing to step into Manhattan, to build a palace that would combine wealth, taste, and discretion in a manner no one had ever seen. Canfield's early years reveal the contradictions that would define his life. A man who sought cultivation while profiting from weakness, a philosopher in a world of pragmatism, a strategist who valued people as much as profit. The stage was set, the pieces were in motion, and Providence, with its harbor and fading whaling fleets, had already cast the first die in a game that would extend to the heart of America's wealthiest city. Richard Canfield's Providence operations were small but precise. Unlike the chaotic gambling dens of the era, his rooms were carefully curated environments. Velvet drapes muffled the noise of clinking chips and shuffling cards. Discreet attendants attended to the needs of patrons with an elegance that set Canfield apart. He understood that the wealthy sought more than chance. They craved recognition, sophistication, and subtle prestige. At Canfield's tables, losing money could feel almost noble, a small sacrifice in an atmosphere of cultivated indulgence. The young operator's reputation grew steadily. Those who frequented his establishments whispered about the man who could read a room with uncanny accuracy, who understood each gambler's temperament, who enforced fairness while preserving an air of exclusive mystery. Canfield's operations were technically illegal, yet he navigated the gray areas with finesse. He paid attention to the police, greased the right palms when necessary, and never provoked open hostility. In every sense, he had become the architect of discretion, a guardian of a world that few outsiders could ever penetrate. By the mid-1880s, Canfield's ambitions outgrew Providence. The city was too small, the patrons too limited, and the opportunities to create something truly extraordinary were scarce. Manhattan, with its wealth, influence, and appetite for elegance, beckoned. New York offered challenges as daunting as its promise: corruption, scrutiny, and competition from entrenched operators. But Canfield saw the risk not as a threat, but as a calculus, another puzzle in which the correct combination of taste, discretion, and psychology could yield extraordinary results. Arriving in Manhattan, Canfield surveyed the landscape with a tactician's eye. The city's gambling scene was chaotic, dominated by flashy, brash operators who valued money above refinement. Patrons were treated as customers to be exploited, not as connoisseurs of experience. Canfield envisioned a different approach, an establishment that combined opulence with discretion, luxury with subtle psychological insight. It would be a palace of chance, a place where the elite could indulge safely, surrounded by refinement and away from prying eyes. The acquisition of 5 East 44th Street became the linchpin of his Manhattan strategy. The brownstone, nestled between 5th and Madison Avenues, was a building of elegance and stature, perfectly suited to the transformation Canfield envisioned. He spared no expense on renovations. Mahogany paneling, imported carpets, discreet lighting, and private gaming rooms created an atmosphere unlike anything New York had seen. The building was more than a gambling house. It was a curated experience, a sanctuary where wealth met taste and discretion. Canfield's operation was also a psychological theater. He meticulously selected staff who could execute his vision of elegance and discretion. Dealers were trained not only in cards, but in subtle etiquette, in reading the moods of patrons. Waiters and attendants became invisible yet indispensable parts of the experience. Every detail, from the arrangement of tables to the timing of breaks, was calculated to ensure comfort, stimulation, and a sense of exclusive privilege. Word of the new Manhattan establishment spread quickly through elite social circles. Patrons who had previously tolerated coarse, brash gambling dens now sought the refinement Canfield offered. Millionaires arrived, intrigued by reports of a house where discretion was absolute and elegance was expected. Canfield did not advertise. He did not need to. The right reputation traveled through whispered introductions, private recommendations, and a careful cultivation of social networks. The city's wealthy recognized immediately that here was a man who understood their desires and could provide them in a way no one else could. Yet, even as success came, the legal and moral shadows loomed. Canfield remained technically outside the law, operating in a world that could collapse under reformist pressure. The constant tension between discretion and exposure shaped every decision. Every bribe, every subtle negotiation with police and politicians became part of an invisible strategy to protect his palace of chance. The stakes were higher than the money at the tables. They were stakes of survival, reputation, and the fragile preservation of a carefully constructed world. By the 1890s, Canfield had established himself as the preeminent operator of elite gambling in Manhattan. The 44th Street house was no longer merely profitable, it was legendary. Wealthy patrons arrived not merely to gamble, but to experience an environment that respected their social status, intelligence, and taste. The house operated with a rare combination of audacity and decorum, a duality that mirrored Canfield himself. A man who profited from human weakness yet conducted himself with composure and cultivation that in this period. Canfield's personal philosophy guided his every action. Schopenhauer's teachings on desire, patience, and human behavior were not abstract musings, they were applied science. Canfield observed, calculated, and adapted. He maintained a calm exterior while controlling environments and outcomes with precision. It was this blend of intellect, taste, and psychological acuity that allowed him to navigate a risky, semi-legal enterprise successfully, earning respect, fear, and admiration in equal measure. By the turn of the century, Manhattan's elite had discovered Canfield's palace. The gambler from Providence had transformed into a curator of experience, a man whose vision had created something unprecedented. What he had built was more than a business, it was a social phenomenon. Yet, the pressures that had tested him in Providence, law, reform, and human unpredictability, would soon confront him on a scale far greater than he had anticipated. The stage was set for triumph and challenge alike, and Canfield's skill, patience, and discretion would be tested as never before. By the dawn of the 20th century, 5 East 44th Street had become a theater of elegance, discretion, and controlled risk, a palace of chance unrivaled in Manhattan. From the polished wood floors to the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, every element was carefully orchestrated to create an environment in which wealth, taste, and subtle danger converged. Patrons did not merely gamble. They participated in a social performance, one that elevated their losses into rituals of sophistication. Canfield understood that his clients were not only looking to wager money. They sought affirmation of their status, recognition among peers, and the thrill of playing within a controlled, exclusive environment. The house was more than a gambling operation. It was a stage on which the city's elite could act out their ambitions, vanities, and desires without judgment. Millionaires arrived in tailored suits, diplomats strolled through the rooms with cautious curiosity, and financiers discussed politics and art between hands of faro or baccarat. Canfield curated the experience meticulously, ensuring that every guest felt both welcome and discreetly distinguished. Staff at 44th Street were trained to anticipate needs before they were expressed. Dealers, waiters, and attendants performed with silent precision, their movements blending into the background while subtly guiding the rhythm of the games. Canfield observed quietly, a conductor of an invisible orchestra, adjusting tables, timing, and lighting to maintain the ideal balance of tension and comfort. Losing a fortune here was almost poetic. Winning a hand felt like an affirmation of intelligence and good taste. The experience was designed to make money secondary to the aura of elegance and discretion, but the palace was not immune to risk. Operating outside the law required constant vigilance. Bribes to politicians, discreet payments to police, and careful management of reputation were as essential as the velvet chairs and crystal chandeliers. Canfield was always alert to whispers of reformers or potential raids, moving with the calm composure that had become his signature. While others panicked at the prospect of exposure, he treated legal and social threats as part of the strategic game, much like a hand of cards that demanded patience, calculation, and timing. The social dimension of the palace also offered unexpected opportunities. Canfield mingled with artists, writers, and intellectuals who visited for curiosity or private introductions. These connections allowed him to cultivate a persona beyond that of a gambling operator. He read voraciously, studied philosophy, and maintained correspondence with thinkers both in America and Europe. His cultivated taste was not performative, it was genuine. Whistler, Sargent, and other artists recognized this authenticity, and it set Canfield apart from the brash, purely profit-driven operators who dominated the city's illicit economy. By this period, Canfield had begun blending the worlds of gambling and art patronage. Paintings adorned the walls of the gaming rooms, each piece carefully selected to project refinement and status. Guests were subtly reminded that they were not merely in a den of chance. They were participants in a cultivated, aesthetically elevated experience. The environment transformed gambling from mere risk-taking into a social ritual, a theater in which wealth, taste, and self-possession were on display. Losing here was a matter of style. Winning was confirmation of both skill and social acumen. Despite the glamour, the underlying realities remained. Patrons were human, vulnerable to compulsions and excess. Canfield did not cheat, but he understood the psychology of gambling as few could. He set odds fairly, yet the environment encouraged continued play. The house always won over time, not by deceit, but through design. Every table, every dealer, every attentive gesture was calculated to maintain engagement without overt coercion. The line between entertainment and predation was narrow, but Canfield navigated it with remarkable skill. The palace also became a hub of information and influence. Conversations overheard at tables, observations of behavior, and the subtle interplay of personalities allowed Canfield to understand New York's elite in ways no banker or politician could. He became a silent observer of power, a collector not only of art but of human behavior. The ability to read men, anticipate desires, and respond with discretion was as valuable as any fortune he accumulated. Yet, shadows always lurked. The press, reformers, and the ever-watchful authorities posed constant threats. Canfield's operations required both elegance and caution. Any misstep could provoke scandal or legal action. Every guest's trust had to be maintained, every transaction conducted with discretion. The interplay of risk and refinement defined the experience. Patrons were drawn not merely to gamble, but to participate in a carefully controlled illusion of freedom and sophistication. By 1900, Canfield's Manhattan establishment had achieved legendary status. Stories circulated among the wealthy and influential, tales of a house where discretion was paramount, elegance was expected, and the thrill of the game was inseparable from the experience of cultivated luxury. The Palace of Chance was more than a business. It was a social institution, a carefully crafted world in which power, wealth, and taste converged under the watchful eyes of a man who had mastered both human behavior and the art of concealment. Even as success reached its zenith, Canfield's personal philosophy remained constant. He understood that this world was fragile, contingent on discretion, reputation, and the fickle whims of social and legal forces. His cultivation of patience, observation, and composure, drawn from years of study and experience, allowed him to maintain equilibrium. He was both participant and observer, a man who profited from vice yet remained its subtle master, controlling the narrative of his palace as surely as he controlled the flow of cards and coins within its walls. The Palace of Chance had reached its apex. The elite of Manhattan knew its doors, whispered its secrets, and revered its discretion. Canfield had created something unprecedented, a space where wealth, elegance, and risk intertwined, producing a world entirely his own. And yet, like all human constructs, it was subject to the inexorable march of change. The city around him evolved, reformers stirred, and the forces that would eventually challenge his empire were quietly gathering. In this crucible of refinement and risk, Canfield stood at the center, composed, observing, and calculating. He had built the most elegant gambling house in American history, and its success relied not only on wealth but on psychology, taste, and human understanding. The Palace of Chance was not merely a business. It was the physical manifestation of a mind attuned to complexity, a man who had learned to operate at the intersection of law, morality, and desire. By the early 1900s, the aura of invincibility that had surrounded 44th Street began to waver. The progressive movement, gaining momentum across America, cast a long shadow over the gilded corridors of Manhattan's elite gambling establishments. Reformers spoke with moral certainty, decrying the corruption that allowed vice to flourish in plain sight. Canfield, ever observant, noted the shift in political winds as carefully as he had once watched the behavior of his patrons. The first signs were subtle. Newspapers, once indifferent or amused, began to publish articles condemning the open indulgence of gambling in the city's heart. Headlines hinted at scandal, emphasizing moral decay and public cost. Politicians, mindful of public opinion, started to distance themselves from the arrangements that had long protected houses like Canfield's. The carefully calibrated system of discrete payments and private understandings that had allowed operations to continue without interference was beginning to fracture. Canfield did not panic. He had anticipated such challenges and understood the cyclical nature of political and social pressure. The legal system moved slowly, but it moved inexorably. Each delay, each postponement of a hearing, allowed him to maintain the semblance of normalcy, but he knew the storm was approaching. To sustain his empire, he relied increasingly on his Saratoga summer resort, a seasonal haven that allowed wealthy gamblers to escape scrutiny. The resort was not just an auxiliary enterprise, it was a lifeline. Income from Saratoga funded legal defenses and maintained the lifestyle that had become synonymous with Canfield's name. Despite these precautions, the December 1902 raid on 44th Street marked a turning point. Police officers, emboldened by reformist rhetoric and public scrutiny, descended upon the establishment. Patrons were escorted out discreetly, yet the shockwaves of the raid rippled through Manhattan's elite. The illusion of invulnerability was shattered. The tables that had once commanded hundreds of thousands of dollars per evening were temporarily silent. Staff, trained for elegance and discretion, now faced questions and interruptions. The atmosphere changed permanently. A sense of impending risk replaced the carefree luxury that had defined the palace. Canfield's response was methodical. He retained the best legal counsel, maneuvered carefully through court proceedings, and negotiated settlements that minimized personal exposure. Jerome, the relentless reformist prosecutor, became a constant presence in the narrative of 44th Street, a figure representing the inevitable reach of law over wealth and vice. By 1904, Canfield secured a conviction on gambling charges, but the sentence, a fine rather than imprisonment, was symbolic. The real consequence lay in the shifting landscape of power and regulation. Canfield's era of openly operating a luxurious gambling house in Manhattan was coming to an end. Even as the pressure mounted, Canfield maintained composure. Years of philosophical study, particularly his engagement with Schopenhauer, had instilled a detachment that allowed him to navigate adversity with calm precision. He understood that personal attachment to the operation could cloud judgment. Adaptability was paramount. Closing 44th Street, while painful, was inevitable. The settlement of the criminal case formalized restrictions on future operations, codifying the decline he had long anticipated. Yet, the palace was not yet silent. Some patrons returned cautiously, testing the waters of legality and discretion. Canfield allowed the operation to continue in reduced form, not out of defiance, but from a pragmatic understanding of human behavior and financial necessity. The thrill of the game, the allure of refined indulgence, remained, but it was tempered by awareness of risk. The very elements that had made the house exceptional, the elegance, the secrecy, the social theater, were now tinged with anxiety. The contrast between the thriving peak of 44th Street and the gradual erosion of its power was stark. Canfield's attentiveness to detail, his understanding of psychology, and his cultivation of refinement could not halt the tide of social reform. The political and moral currents of the era were inexorable. The Palace of Chance had demonstrated that vice could be elevated, that gambling could be conducted with style and discretion, but these lessons were not enough to withstand systemic change. The raid and ensuing legal pressures also revealed the fragility of reputation. Word traveled quickly through elite circles. Whispers of investigation and indictment cast shadows over the social legitimacy of patrons. The discretion that had once been a hallmark of the house became a liability. Canfield's skill in managing appearances, always central to his operations, was tested to its limits. Maintaining client trust required not only adherence to protocol, but also an unspoken assurance that their indulgence would not invite public censure. Even as 44th Street faced decline, the broader human story persisted. Patrons continued to gamble, to flirt with fortune and risk, and Canfield continued to observe, adapt, and guide. The lessons he had learned in the early days of Providence and Saratoga were now applied under far greater scrutiny. The palace, though under siege, remained a controlled environment, a testament to the operator's understanding of risk, psychology, and social dynamics. BY 1907, the final chapter of Canfield's gambling career approached. Saratoga, too, succumbed to the pressures that had dismantled Manhattan's operations. The summer resort, once a haven of seasonal indulgence, closed permanently. Canfield, now 52, faced the end of an era he had shaped with precision, taste, and calculated risk. Yet, he faced it with dignity and philosophical detachment. He had anticipated the impermanence of wealth and power, and now, like a master of a fading theater, he could step away without bitterness, preserving his reputation and personal integrity. The decline of 44th Street was not merely the story of a business under siege. It was the narrative of a man navigating the shifting boundaries of legality, morality, and social expectation. Canfield had built something extraordinary, a palace that combined elegance, psychology, and discretion. Its fall, though inevitable, underscored the brilliance of its creation. As reformers celebrated and the city evolved, the operator prepared to pivot, to convert his wealth, taste, and cultivated intellect into a new chapter of life beyond cards, chips, and clandestine tables. The closure of 44th Street marked not an end, but a transformation. Canfield, now stripped of the empire he had meticulously built, turned his attention toward a world that had long fascinated him: the arts. While the gambling tables had showcased his mastery of human behavior, the galleries and studios offered a different challenge, a realm governed by taste, discernment, and the subtle interplay of cultural capital. Unlike the palpable stakes of money and risk at 44th Street, the art world demanded judgment and patience, qualities Canfield had cultivated through decades of observing the human psyche. His friendship with James McNeill Whistler, the notoriously exacting painter, became central to this new life. Their relationship had begun in the late 1890s, when Canfield, already recognized as a cultivated and intelligent observer, was introduced to the artistic circles of Manhattan and London. Whistler, famed for his precision, refinement, and sometimes acerbic temperament, found in Canfield a kindred spirit. Unlike others, Canfield was patient, composed, and genuinely interested in the subtle interplay of technique, color, and expression. In him, Whistler discovered a friend and patron who could appreciate artistry without deference to mere fashion or notoriety. The portrait of Canfield, painted in Whistler's London studio over multiple sessions, became the centerpiece of both their relationship and Canfield's emerging identity. In the image, Canfield gazes outward with serene self-possession, a man of refinement and discernment rather than a gambling operator navigating clandestine tables. The sitter's calm demeanor, captured through Whistler's exacting brush, belied the turbulent life that had preceded the commission. It represented a moment of control, a frozen instance in which Canfield could inhabit the cultivated self he had long aspired to be. With 44th Street shuttered and Saratoga permanently closed by 1907, Canfield dedicated himself fully to collecting and curating works of art. The wealth accumulated during his years in gambling provided the means, while his cultivated judgment ensured that acquisitions were based on quality rather than prestige. Canfield's tastes were discerning. He pursued works that reflected genuine artistic achievement, from Whistler's impressionistic nuances to the subtleties of Dutch masters and English portraiture. His collection was not vast in quantity, but it was exceptional in coherence and refinement. As the years passed, Canfield's presence in the art world grew. Dealers sought his opinion, Museums welcomed his patronage, and critics respected his judgment. The man who had once facilitated clandestine games of chance now influenced public understanding of artistic value. Essays he wrote on Whistler and other subjects demonstrated not only a keen eye, but also thoughtful, analytical prose. In art, as in gambling, Canfield observed patterns, anticipated outcomes, and evaluated risk. Though now the stakes were intellectual and aesthetic rather than financial, the transformation was not merely external, it was deeply personal. Canfield found in the arts a form of legitimacy, a world where his knowledge, cultivation, and taste could be recognized without moral compromise. The stress, fear, and secrecy that had defined his gambling operations gave way to contemplation and measured engagement. He moved through exhibitions, auctions, and salons with the same grace and discretion that had once served him at the tables, but now he was fully visible, no longer navigating clandestine worlds, yet the shadow of his past remained. Canfield's history as a gambling operator lingered in whispers, in the footnotes of society pages and reformist commentaries. Some observers found the juxtaposition difficult to reconcile, a man who had profited from vice now an arbiter of taste and refinement. But Canfield himself embraced the contradictions. To him, the gambling years had been a means, not an end. They had provided the capital and experience necessary to enter a world that valued intellect, patience, and cultivation. Where others saw moral ambiguity, Canfield perceived opportunity for personal and cultural enrichment. The Whistler portrait became his constant companion, a visual anchor connecting past triumphs with present pursuits. Canfield would often sit before it, contemplating the image of himself as a man in command, calm and self-assured. The painting symbolized not only friendship and taste, but also the continuity of his personal identity across the dramatic upheavals of his life. It was a reminder that while empires could fall and fortunes could vanish, the cultivated self, shaped by intellect, experience, and discernment, could endure. To be why the 1910s, Canfield's daily life had settled into routines of quiet cultivation. He corresponded with artists, critics, and collectors, attending exhibitions and social gatherings with a measured presence that contrasted sharply with the energetic hustle of his former gambling empire. He lived well, but not ostentatiously, focusing on intellectual and aesthetic pleasures rather than material display. His health, though beginning to show the wear of years and previous stress, did not diminish his capacity for engagement with the art world. Through this transition, Canfield demonstrated an adaptability that was as strategic and calculated as any move he had made at the gambling tables. The skills honed in observing human behavior, assessing risk, and maintaining discretion translated seamlessly into evaluating artistic merit, negotiating acquisitions, and cultivating a reputation grounded in integrity and taste. In this sense, the shift from gambling to art collecting was not a reinvention so much as a realignment, leveraging past experience to navigate new terrain. That by the time of his death in 1914, Richard Canfield had fully inhabited this new identity. The man who had once presided over clandestine palaces of chance now existed in the world of public taste and cultural influence. His collection, including the treasured Whistler portrait, would outlast him, cementing a legacy defined not only by the audacity of his earlier ventures, but by the refinement and judgment of his later years. In the halls of museums, the calm gaze of Canfield in evening dress endures, a silent testament to the complexity of a life lived at the intersection of vice, wealth, culture, and intellect. As the 1910s progressed, Richard Canfield's life assumed a rhythm far removed from the clandestine pulse of 44th Street or the seasonal excitement of Saratoga. The gambling empire that had defined his identity was gone, yet the man who had built it remained undiminished in intellect and cultivation. His days unfolded in measured routines, dominated by correspondence with artists, visits to exhibitions, and the meticulous expansion of his collection. The frenetic pace of managing millions of dollars and evading police raids had been replaced by quiet reflection and deliberate engagement. That Canfield's health, however, was not immune to the passage of time. The accumulated stress of decades of operating outside the law, combined with the inevitable wear of age, left its mark. Contemporaries noted a subtle but unmistakable decline in vitality. His once commanding presence now carried the weight of experience and endurance, a reminder that even the most disciplined lives yield to the toll of years. Yet, despite these limitations, Canfield's mind remained sharp, his judgment precise, and his appreciation for beauty undiminished. The Whistler portrait continued to occupy a central place in his life. It was more than a work of art. It was a mirror, a reminder of the man he had been and the life he had led. To visitors, the portrait exuded composure and sophistication, masking the tumultuous past that had produced such a cultivated gaze. For Canfield, it symbolized continuity, an anchor amid the inevitable transformation of time. It embodied the paradox that had defined his existence. A criminal by circumstance, a gentleman by choice, a profiteer of vice, yet a patron of culture. Canfield's relationship with his wife, Genevieve, deepened in these final years. She had endured his rise and fall, maintaining a quiet dignity throughout the turbulence of his career. Now, as they moved together through the social spaces of the art world, she shared openly in the fruits of his cultivated pursuits. Their bond, forged through decades of unconventional living, became a stabilizing presence in a life once dominated by risk, secrecy, and the pressure of public scrutiny. In 1912, the brownstone at 44th Street, the epicenter of his empire, was sold. The property, once a palace of chance and elegance, passed into commercial hands. Its historical significance unmarked, it vanished from memory as quickly as the fortunes it had hosted. The sale price, reportedly around $300,000, recovered only a portion of his investment, yet Canfield accepted it with characteristic pragmatism. The dispersal of his remaining art collection followed a similar trajectory. Works sold through auctions and private transactions, their value recognized by collectors who appreciated quality over notoriety. The Whistler portrait, however, remained with him, untouchable, a personal relic of a life of paradox. As the world edged closer to the First World War, the social and economic context around Canfield shifted dramatically. Manhattan, once defined by gilded elegance and exclusive vice, transformed into a bustling commercial hub. The corridors of wealth he had once navigated now catered to business magnates rather than gamblers. Canfield's invisibility, so crucial to his success, was no longer a necessity. In this transformed environment, he could simply exist, no longer compelled to negotiate the delicate balances of legality and discretion. The man who had once orchestrated the flow of money and risk among America's wealthiest now confronted the ultimate randomness, mortality. On December 11, 1914, in a sudden and tragic turn, Richard Canfield's life ended not with deliberation, but by accident. While descending a subway staircase at 14th Street in Manhattan, he fell, sustaining a fatal skull fracture. Transported to a hospital, he passed away the following day at the age of 59. The death was ruled accidental. No intrigue, no revenge, no gambling odds. Only the cruel indifference of chance. There is an almost cinematic irony in his demise. A man who had built a career on calculating risk, predicting behavior, and orchestrating outcomes fell victim to a moment entirely beyond control. The streets of Manhattan, bustling with commuters unaware of the history beneath their feet, became the final stage for the gambler who had once orchestrated grand dramas behind closed doors. Canfield's death, quiet and unremarkable in immediate circumstance, contrasted sharply with the high-stakes drama that had defined his adult life. The obituaries and contemporary assessments reflected the enduring contradictions of his life. Some praised his integrity, emphasizing that he had never cheated patrons or misrepresented his operations. Others condemned him as a corrupter of morals, a man who profited from human weakness. In every account, however, there was acknowledgement of his remarkable acumen, his taste, and his capacity for refinement. The debate over his character mirrored broader societal tensions between vice and virtue, indulgence and discipline, questions that continue to resonate a century later. What remains of Richard Canfield is, in essence, a study in contradictions. The brownstone is gone, the gambling tables dismantled, the patrons dispersed. The Whistler portrait endures, a solitary witness to a life lived on multiple planes. His collection, scattered to museums and private hands, continues to testify to his cultivated judgment. The story of Canfield is less a tale of crime or morality than a meditation on adaptability, refinement, and the intricate dance between circumstance and choice. Richard Canfield died neither as the criminal prosecutors portrayed nor as the cultivated gentleman his friends admired. He died as the sum of both, a man shaped by the opportunities and limits of his era, by ambition and intellect, by risk and taste. The empire he built, the lives he influenced, the culture he cultivated, all of it vanished in physical form, yet endured in memory, art, and the paradoxes he embodied. The subway staircase at 14th Street offers no monument, no warning, no celebration. It processes thousands of commuters daily, none aware that a man who had once dominated Manhattan's secret corridors of wealth and risk met his end there. Yet the legacy persists. Canfield's story continues to provoke questions. How do we reconcile enterprise and exploitation, taste and vice, discretion and influence? In galleries and museums, in the history books and whispered lore, Richard Canfield endures, a figure at once celebrated and condemned, admired and misunderstood, a gambler, a collector, a man forever negotiating the delicate line between chance and control. The story of Richard Canfield ends not with a fanfare, but with quiet reflection. The brownstone at 44th Street, once a palace of chance and elegance, has vanished, replaced by the relentless machinery of Midtown Manhattan. The tables that held fortunes, the rooms that echoed with whispered wagers, the secret doors that admitted the wealthy and the powerful, none remain. Murray Hill's Gilded Age charm has been absorbed into the grid of commerce, leaving only shadows of the world Canfield once inhabited. Yet, in the heart of a museum gallery, the Whistler portrait persists. There he sits, gazing out with the calm composure that so defined him in life. The painting is a fragment of memory, a frozen moment of certainty amid a career built on risk and uncertainty. Visitors pass by, unaware of the empire of chance that once lay behind that serene expression, yet the portrait speaks silently of ambition, refinement, and the contradictions of a life both cultivated and morally ambiguous. That Canfield's legacy is a study in paradox. He profited from human weakness while pursuing beauty and intellect with unerring seriousness. He operated outside the law yet earned respect in the art world. He built a house where vice appeared elegant, only to see it vanish under the weight of reform and chance. In every sense, he was a man of his time, yet somehow ahead of it. An operator of risk who understood the value of patience, observation, and taste. History has transformed the narrative of gambling itself. The activities that once condemned him are now embraced, sanctioned, and regulated. Las Vegas, Atlantic City, state lotteries, online casinos. The impulses Canfield facilitated endure, magnified beyond imagination. The irony is unmistakable. Society now celebrates what once imprisoned him, and yet few remember the man who first bridged discretion, sophistication, and vice. Richard Canfield's life reminds us that history is rarely simple, and human character never wholly conforms to expectation. The empire he built is gone, the gamblers are forgotten, and the reformers are distant memories. What remains is the story itself, a gambler who never gambled, a criminal who cultivated beauty, a man whose paradoxes endure long after the brownstone doors closed forever. The cards have been dealt, the players departed, and the house stands only in memory, in legend, and in the gaze of a painted face that watches over the history he once shaped.